Well, welcome all of you, and welcome Katie and Jan. It's wonderful to have you with us. Well, first I would like to introduce myself. I'm Pablo Pérez Castello, a junior fellow of the Animals and Biodiversity program at the Global Research Network. And I'm going to chair this event today. It's the third conversation of the conversation series on animal justice and animal politics. So I know that some of you have probably attended all of our conversations. So about the format, as perhaps some of you already know, first I will ask a few questions to Jan and Katie, and they will just chat about it, debate, have say to us some thoughts. In some cases, it will be more explanatory. In others, we will have more of a debate, more of a discussion. And then that should last around 1 hour, 1 hour and 10 minutes. It depends how the conversation goes. And then afterwards, we will have around 30 minutes, 20 minutes for questions and answers. That's more or less what the format will be like. So let me now introduce our wonderful speakers today. Kathryn Gillespie, Katie, is a postdoctoral scholar in geography at the University of Kentucky. Her work focuses on the everyday violence to which other species are subjected under capitalist and settler colonial regimes, with a particular focus on animals in agriculture. She is the author of The Cow with EA Tag 1389 with University of Chicago Press, and has published in journals such as Politics and Animals, Environment and Planning, and A Antipode, Animal Studies Journal, Hypatia, and Gender, Place and Culture. Jan Dutkiewicz is a policy fellow at the Animal Law and Policy Program at Harvard Law School and the Swiss National Science Foundation Synergia postdoctoral fellow at Concordia University. His research focuses on the political economy of meat, including both derived meat and alternative proteins. And he's finishing a book about industrialized meat production in the United States. He has written about the politics of food, animals, and the environment for publications, including Wired, The Washington Post, The Guardian, The New Republic, The Wall Street Journal, Dissent, and Jacobin. I don't know if I said it before, because I always get a bit nervous when I begin with these things, but we are going to discuss today about animal agriculture, basically. I think I didn't say the title. I'm also sharing this room today in a different place because I moved to the US recently with Emma, a cat. So she's now on the table, so you might see her around, for example, like now. Come on, Emma. Thank you. Sorry about that, guys. With animals, we're going to talk about animals today as well. So anyways, let me begin then a little bit for people who perhaps are not familiar with the history of animal agriculture and what animal agriculture is about. I wanted to ask this first question to Jan. So if you could explain to us a little bit, Jan, for people who are unfamiliar with this topic, what is animal agriculture and its history, because I know it's very linked with colonialism. So if you could tell us a bit about that at the beginning, please.
Yeah, so I mean, of course, I can't tell you a story about animal agriculture as a whole. This would be an impossible topic. I could recommend you stacks of books, but I think given the topic today, I think what you're primarily asking about is industrialized animal agriculture and factory farming, specifically in the, let's say, the American or North American model, which is fast globalizing. I mean, there's also a long story here, and it's hard to tell one clear story, given different attempts to raise animals in a concentrated fashion, which is to say in one place, fed a constant diet using an economies of scale model in different places throughout history. So I don't want to suggest that this is something that sort of sprang entirely into being exclusively in the American context in the timeline that I'm going to tell you about. But in brief, and sort of being cognizant of time, the very short version of the story in the United States, at least, is that you have the arrival of large-scale ranching, which is to say cattle production with the arrival of colonialism, right? So the first colonists bring with them animals. They bring with them animals that make up part of the local political economy. So they need them for food. So you have chickens, you have pigs, you have cows, you have sheep, and so on. But cows primarily, given their sort of need to graze and their need to range, are a driving force. They're a driving aspect of westward expansion, right? Because as land grants are given to colonists to move westward, and as land grants are given for them to sort of establish homestead, establish parcels of land, later in American history, as new states are created, you really have ranching being the spearhead of westward expansion. And there's an extremely good book by Joshua Specht called Red Meat Republic that I would recommend if people are interested in the broader story of the role of ranching in the creation of the American state and the displacement of indigenous peoples and indigenous foodways to make way for a very specific private property-based, family-based, ranching-based vision of American agriculture. So basically you have cows, and cows are instrumental into creating the American state. And maybe we can talk more about that later in the Q&A. And then you've got small scale farming for other animals. And so then when we're talking about factory farming, I think it's very important for people to understand historically that what actually preceded industrialized animal farming was industrialized animal slaughter. And so you have the emergence in cities like Cincinnati, in cities like Chicago, sort of in the latter few decades of the 1800s and then looping forward into the early 20th century. You have the establishment of large-scale, primarily urban slaughterhouses. And the way these worked is that farmers would drive be it their cattle or their pigs to large sort of urban spaces where the animals would eat food, recover from the journey, be fattened for slaughter, and then be slaughtered on very much an industrial assembly, or in this case, disassembly line model. And what I mean by that is if you imagine sort of like a modern industrial Ford cars assembly line, it worked very much like that. So slaughter was turned by these industrialists, especially in Cincinnati and Chicago, into an industrial process of low-skilled workers doing the same repeated actions on one place on an assembly line, sort of working shoulder by shoulder with another worker. So one person cuts a given sinew or tendon, one person removes the trotters, one person splits the body, one person removes the entrails, and so on throughout the entire workday. And what this does is it standardizes the slaughter process and increases throughput and allows for the production of very much standardized cuts of meat. And so then these people, they were called the Beef Trust. And these are the people that Upton Sinclair wrote about in The Jungle, the sort of famous muckraking novel about the conditions of labor and animals in Chicago's packing town in the early 20th century. What these people did is they turned meat into very much a commodity in the sense of a standardized good that can be purchased by anyone in the market. And of course, they were massively aided not just by their own capacity to organize economies of scale production, but by refrigerated transport, especially on rail cars. So meat that was produced in Cincinnati or Chicago could now be shipped by rail car to distant urban centers. So all of a sudden, someone in Pennsylvania or in Philadelphia or New York City could be eating these standardized cuts of beef, bacon, et cetera, that were produced quite far away. And so these early industrialists basically create a market and de facto create consumers for what we would now call industrial meat production. There's much more to say there, but I wanted to flag that because it isn't until different aspects of everything from architecture to biological to veterinary science come along that these logics of industrial production are actually brought to animal farming. So for a long time, you have industrialized slaughter, smaller scale farming. And then slowly, starting with chickens, as the story goes, primarily in the Delmarva Peninsula in Maryland, you've got the emergence of concentrated chicken feeding, which is to say large numbers of creatures raised, first indoors, outdoors, and then increasingly exclusively indoors in a concentrated fashion to produce eggs and meat. And so then slowly this spreads via what the scholar Ellen Silbergeld calls the chickenization of American political economy to the production of pork, and then to the establishment of large-scale industrial feedlots for cattle. And once this takes off, so I mean, for chickens, we're talking slowly starting in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, but really taking hold, especially with pigs in the 70s and 80s. You've got the birth of what are called concentrated animal feeding operations, or what we call factory farms. And I think the easiest definition there is just sites where animals are deprived of virtually all natural behavior, housed primarily indoors in artificial conditions, raised strictly with a view of maximizing feed conversion ratio, which is to say growing into saleable meat as fast as possible and being fed primarily a processed diet of feed grown specifically for them. So they're not foraging, they're being fed a processed feed. And the geographer Tony Weiss basically calls this transformation the meatification of agriculture, which is to say the creation of a value chain that starts with monocrop feed and oil seeds, which are then fed to what are de facto animal monocrops, who then produce standardized meat as a standardized commodity for a mass market. So that's the fastest I could do the answer to that question. And I think that's primarily the context about which we're talking here.
That's wonderful, Jan. Yes, I have a couple of things to say about this. So when I was asking the question on colonialism, perhaps I didn't frame it properly. One of the things that, and I would also like to direct people to the work of Kelly Struthers Montfort and Chloe Taylor, Colonialism and Animality. And one of the things that Kelly in particular explains there is that animal agriculture in a way sort of transformed, transformed. It was sort of Westerners brought this understanding of land as being just private property and changed our relationship to land so that it was just, something that we own, including non-human animals. And there was this idea that the Native Americans were not civil because the relationship to land was not like that. So it kind of had a civilizational touch to it, or kind of force animal agriculture and the industrialization then of. But I also wanted to ask you, Katie, now listening to Jan, because I've just checked our questions and we don't really have a question on the commodification of animals, which is very important. And I know you've done a lot of work on this. So I was wondering whether you had any comments on the matter. You wanted to add something to what Jan said in that respect.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you've touched on it, really well, Pablo, and in the sense of, land being sort of rendered property by settler colonists in North America, and that with that rendering of land as property, animals are also property, and that goes back, much further than North American colonization. I mean, cattle were the first capital. Cattle, the word is rooted in chattel. So, I mean, as long as there's been capitalism, there's been the commodification of animals, and that started with cows, but it quickly evolved into commodifying other animals. And so I think that I think what we see now is this sort of intensification of commodification, and tied in with all that Jan just said about the sort of industrialization, the intensification of production, and so it's maybe much more transparent the way that commodification impacts animals today, because it's this kind of hyper commodification. But sort of older forms of agriculture, I think, sort of concealed that commodification status in the sense of narratives about small scale farming practices of care and of sort of kinship, or so-called humane slaughter. All of those kind of narratives work to obscure, one, that animals are commodities, and two, that status I've been thinking is the root of the harm that animals experience. But I don't, you can commodification is not the whole story. So I think this relationship between property and this kind of idea of living property and commodification is really important. I was just thinking through, and maybe Jan, you have or Pablo have thoughts about this, but I'm working on something on cow-calf operations in North Central Washington, and this idea that the cows, these are cattle raised for beef, and the ranches first use up their own grazing lands, and then they sometimes lease lands from other landowners, private landowners in the area, but they also lease land, public lands. And so, you're driving around up there, and I was driving through the woods, and there are cows on the road and cows in the woods, and sort of loose within these. There are cattle guards on the road, so it's they can't, they're limited in their range, but within that range, they're sort of, free to move around as they like, until they're rounded up and either brought back to the ranch or sent to a feedlot for fattening or sent directly to slaughter. And so, I was thinking about the sort of property status of animals, and it's interesting because they all have ear tags, and everybody in the area knows which ranchers own which cows, because one large rancher has like yellow ear tags and a certain number on them, and another has red, and so they're almost not worried about these animals getting away or being stolen or disappearing, because it's sort of they're both kind of bounded by by the kind of geographic limits of having cattle guards, but also bounded by this kind of status of both property and being a commodity. And so they have these particular cows had like really large brands on their sides, and so there's this like sense of kind of, I don't know, I was thinking about it as kind of confidence or like almost arrogance, that there's just these around the sort of property status of animals. But what I'm interested in hearing, if you guys have any thoughts on this, is so this question of land, and that land is, there's no like land and animals, like there's no land that can't be owned or can't be not owned. And so we have these private landowners, we have these so-called public lands that are state owned lands, I guess, but that there's that kind of colonial way of thinking of so-called nature as property has so thoroughly kind of insinuated itself into every aspect of our environment, of like human animal relations, and that's just it's like sort of the only kind of dominates these ways of thinking and relating to animals. I don't know, do you guys have more thoughts about this kind of relationship between land and like sort of land and property, and animals as property, and the commodification of land as well as of animals, I think?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, but I mean, just quickly, I mean, this might not be all that novel to say, but I mean, it is just a very Lockean notion of right to land, right? That sort of like the property theory of value, which is that you work land or you produce something on land and you generate property by your own labor, which was sort of the theory driving colonialism in the first place, but I think remains. And so I think that that's central to, well, so there are two separate things, which is, first, I think I should say that when I use the term commodity production, I fall into this, I use it in the term that it's used by the USDA or the industry itself, which is large scale production. And I don't mean to suggest that smaller scale production, non-industrial production, is not commodity production. So pardon the slippage. So yeah, absolutely, you're right. But the second thing is that absolutely, I think that this theory that land and property must generate value undergirds the entirety of our relationship to other species, especially around agriculture. And I think you absolutely see this with ranching, with not just ranchers claim to do what they will with their own land, but also, as you said, claims to public land. And as we've seen with the BLM throughout the American West, and ranchers sort of insisting on BLM or the USDA's wildlife services to, for instance, do things like go in and exterminate species that they see as threats to livestock, like So predators like wolves, but also animals they see as potential vectors of disease. And so there's very much a notion that once land is owned, land can be changed in the interest almost strictly of profit generation, in this case, through creating a habitat for commodity cattle, which is, as the Center for Biodiversity has extensive research on this, has shown, basically means denuding nature of other species and native species and biodiversity itself in the interest of protecting the profit interest in commodity cattle. So I think there's a lot there. And I think that dyad of ownership of animals and ownership of land and the claim to the right to profit from both undergirds this sort of triumvirate, or however you want to picture it, relation that you're describing.
Yes, I have a lot to say about this as well, but well, let's improvise a little bit today because we are kind of moving. But one thing that I have been thinking a lot recently, because I've been writing about how wild animals, how we could recognize fundamental rights of wild animals to self-determination in a very concrete way in the Constitution of Australia. And one of the texts I have been engaging with is Karen Bradshaw's Wildlife as Property Owners. And something that, because this relates a lot to your question, Katie, something that shocked me a little bit is that one of the things that Bradshaw discusses there is that how Indigenous peoples relate it to land. And she ascribes to Indigenous people having an understanding of land that is pretty much Western property understandings of land, which makes no sense to me. So the reason why I think Bradshaw is reading that reality in that way is that, in a way, this paradigm of we own land, we own no human animals, property in a way exists, and is kind of, we live in that paradigm. It's as if one could not read reality differently. It's as if one could not relate to land in the absence of property, as it were, and our relationship with non-human animals and so on. So it just seems to be so, it permeates so much our epistemological the dominant epistemology that we have in the Western world, at least, that it's really, well, Western, whatever that might mean. I'm not going to get into this because otherwise it's going to be long here. But the next thing that I wanted us to discuss perhaps was, so kind of, let's try to perhaps zoom into CAFOs, factory farms, basically. And one of the things that happened in the movement, and I wanted us to discuss about this because I know that both of you have thought about this and discussed this in some of your works, is specifically, I wanted to ask this question to you, Katie. It's the question of human workers in factory farms. So how they are, because, one thing that I have experienced, but I think it has changed in the movement, was a sort of vilification of human workers without taking into account their socioeconomic background, their working conditions. And it seems to me that is a pretty important kind of consideration or aspect of our economic and political system that we should take into account in the animal movement. So I was wondering, Kate, if you could tell us a little bit about that, and also Jan, if you have any thoughts, that would be great.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Pablo, and that's been my experience as well in the movement, that there's quite a lot of vilification of people who work in slaughterhouses and factory farms, and I think it is really sort of maybe driven by just a lack of knowledge about the conditions that would make it necessary for someone to take that kind of work, and also a lack of empathy, I think, in terms of trying to imagine what it would be like to be in that position. And so, just in terms of the conditions in these spaces, there's they really take their toll in terms of the physical impacts, repetitive stress injuries, loss of limbs, sometimes even being killed as a result of the work that they do, and a lack of, even just sort of basic sort of workplace rights, I guess, in terms of like they're allowed to take bathroom breaks, for instance, but the line keeps moving. So if you do take a bathroom break, you come back to a pile of, meat that is your, if you're on the line making one cut of meat over and over, that piles up. I have a friend who worked when she immigrated from Mexico and with her family when she was in high school, and went to work in a slaughterhouse in Eastern Washington. And she is very small, maybe 5 feet, and she describes the the work being like so physically difficult because she was making one cut on one piece, on each piece of meat over and over again. And so like physically it was difficult for her to just sort of make the cuts, lift these pieces of meat if she needed to lift them. And that, she would not take a bathroom break because it would either mean that she was so behind or that she had to ask her coworkers on either side of her to help her catch up. And so, there's that just sort of like basic kind of, indignity and real discomfort. I mean, if you think about, having to pee for an 8-hour shift, just what that would, what that basic, thing would be like. In terms of the repetitive stress injuries, she describes coming home and not being able to open her hands, that they were just, she'd have to soak them in water, warm water to be able to open them. And then the next morning she'd have to do it again just so she could go and hold the knife that she needed to hold. But at the same time, she described, a lot of her family members and people in her community worked in orchards and so in seasonal kinds of work. And so the slaughterhouse was actually, reliable. It was comparatively better paid than field or orchard work. And it was secure in that you had year-round employment. And so, in that way, even with the difficulty, there was, if we think about this in relation to the other kinds of really real hardships in terms of food production. I think, slaughterhouses and CAFOs get a lot of, negative attention that can obscure the real kind of violence of having to work in plant-based agriculture as well. And Food Empowerment Project has been doing a lot of work, for instance, on, trying to sort of, I think sort of generate empathy really and knowledge around the indignities and hardship in plant-based agriculture as well. But back to the sort of slaughterhouse and factory farm, I think, Timothy Badshrat's Every 12 Seconds, I think, has a really, wonderful kind of illumination of the realities of this kind of work from a worker's perspective. And, he describes one of the things that has been so memorable for me about that book is that he takes a number of roles in the slaughterhouse, and one of them is liver hanger. And it's, these livers would come in on a conveyor belt and he would take them off and have to put them on these hooks on a cart. And just the sort of boredom of that is I think another form of violence, that there's the sort of physical toll, and then there's the psychological toll in terms of being part of, such a violent kind of system and industry in general. And I think that is sort of especially at the end or the front end of slaughter, where the animals are actually being killed. This friend of mine who worked in a slaughterhouse, for instance, said, she and her coworkers, like later in the line making these cuts, they weren't even thinking about the fact that this was part of, just recently part of a living animal. They were just focused on trying to keep up with the line, and focused on just the pain and discomfort that they were also feeling. So, but I think I think the that boredom is something that doesn't really get kind of talked about as much in terms of these harms, but that this kind of like numbing of the brain through doing this kind of like repetitive sort of mindless work is also, a really, really negative impact. So Jan, do you have other things to add on there?
Well, I agree with everything you're saying, and I would direct readers to Alex Blanchet's phenomenal ethnography, Porkopolis, where he talks about the different forms of labor, including sort of perversely care labor that is required on CAFOs, not at slaughterhouses. So for instance, you've got workers who will, because the modern industrial pig basically has been bred to be so large that its litters are so large that many animals are born as runts, too weak to survive. So you've got workers on CAFOs whose entire job is actually to nurse these runts back to health. So just necessitating vast amounts of care labor just to get animals back up to speed so they can go back and maximize feed conversion ratio and be slaughtered 6 months hence, right? So all kinds of this work goes on. I'd also strongly recommend Vanessa Ribas's book, On the Line, about the nature of slaughter work. But I'm in agreement with Katie. I just wanted to point to, I suppose, 2 structural issues here, and then 1 problem for thinking about this that maybe I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about. The first is that the question of labor, and I'm here talking specifically about slaughterhouse labor, ever since, slaughterhouse labor hasn't changed much, right? Since Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle. And labor is sort of this vexed part of slaughterhouse production because animals are just different enough from each other biologically that you can't automate the process. So you require people. But then the logics of production and profit maximization on the line are such that you want to sort of reduce people to very mechanistic widgets on the line, hence everything Katie described. And the industry has been pushing for this sort of like raw commodification of the labors themselves forever. The meat industry has been central to union busting, waging very successful anti-union campaigns. There's a fantastic documentary, the name of which escapes me, about the famous strike breaking at Hormel in Minnesota in the 70s. And so the idea is to remove workers' bargaining rights, pay them less, give them less autonomy, make them work extremely hard jobs. And this is a basic logic of industrial capitalism, but you really see it viscerally here. And you also saw it, I think, especially during the early COVID outbreak, when slaughterhouses, again, by virtue of the nature of the work, side by side, difficult work, sort of cold, damp spaces, lots of heavy breathing, they were sites of infection. And the meat companies knew this very quickly. And so what they did is they immediately turned and lobbied, and there's extensive sort of email trails that show this is the case, lobbied the USDA under Trump, under Sonny Perdue, so the USDA would not shut down slaughterhouses, right? And they went so far as to take out full-page ads in the New York Times to say, like, we can't shut down slaughterhouses because this would threaten national food security. So the story I'm trying to tell here is one of an industry which is dead set on, which both relies on this highly marginalized, highly difficult, highly injurious labor, but also strives to make it even more marginalized and even more injurious, right? And I think the COVID case is absolutely telling here, when they were willing to sacrifice people on the altar of cheap meat. So, but this brings me to a sort of vexed problem. So there is very much an intersectional argument here, which is that animals and these workers are both led to be exploited by similar logics of capital accumulation by the meat industry. But the question is, what do you do about it? And I think here is where it gets tricky, right? Because, like, do you support, if you're someone who wants an end to CAFOs, does supporting stronger unions or stronger labor protections lead to an end to CAFOs? And I think we have to be clear about the fact that it doesn't. And that's not an argument against supporting stronger labor protections and supporting unionization. Absolutely not. But I think we need to think about the fact that there's perhaps no clean outcome depending on where one's ethical loyalties lie. I mean, short of some kind of like mass just transition, stayed back retraining of everyone currently working in CAFOs and slaughterhouses to other forms of work, not even necessarily other forms of agricultural labor. But then that labor, as Katie said, itself requires better worker protections, better minimum wages, because agricultural workers as a whole, not simply in meatpacking, are I mean, yeah, perversely are both our most essential workers and among our most marginalized workers. And so what I'm saying is it's difficult to see a clean resolution that sort of works in the interest of animals and workers and does justice to them both. And I think that that's a really big challenge, not just for the quote unquote animal movement, but also for the labor movement, for the left, for people who think about just climate transitions and thinking about these sort of intersections and the fact that individual solutions to those individual issues don't necessarily get at the entirety of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is, I agree with everything you said, Jan. It's a really difficult question, I believe. I don't know, Kate, if you have any thoughts on this one, or we should move to the next topic or next question.
Yeah, I don't think I really have anything to add other than, I think it does bring up kind of ideas about how we might kind of manifest more like cross movement collaboration in terms of, there's sort of like the sort of labor movement, there's the animal rights or animal advocacy movement, that there's the environmental movement. I mean, all of these sort of separate, discrete movements have have interests in some of the same goals, but that they can sometimes be sort of at odds with one another. And so I think thinking about sort of more collaboration is one thing. And then also just, that this all gets back to the sort of violence of capital, like the violence of capitalism too. And so, an overthrow of capitalism might help.
I mean, certainly somewhere where we could probably meet with, say, human workers in factory farms is that if the working conditions improve dramatically, it's just the industry would not be sustainable as it is. I mean, it is not already because, this subsidized massively. But if the working conditions improve, things will have to change internally a lot, and probably there will be a reduction of the production of animals and so on. But anyways, what I wanted to ask now. Maybe not.
I mean, one thing I would say though is that I'm not fully sure that's the case, right?
Okay.
Like the meat industry is so profitable that I think it could easily, I mean, much as Amazon could easily unionize, pay all its workers $100,000 a year or more and remain massively profitable. I think that the meat industry is not massively profitable on a per unit basis, which is of course why they try to squeeze efficiency and lower wages and so on. But I think that the meat industry could very easily afford to give greater worker protections and allow workers to unionize and remain profitable. Be less profitable, be less attractive to shareholders and less attractive to the owners of the companies. But I think that absolutely the industry could accept more regulation, more environmental regulation, higher wages, better worker protections, and remain profitable. And I think they don't out of greed and perhaps out of just like a pathological opposition to government interference in their operations. I think what would shut down the industry much quicker is protections for animal laborers, right? Like the United States doesn't have a federally binding animal welfare protection. There's only the Humane Slaughter Act, which is sparsely enforced and only covers the moment of slaughter. I think if you applied the sorts of welfare protections you do to cats and dogs across the board to livestock, the meat industry would fold overnight. If the states that have exemptions for artificial insemination in their sort of bestiality statutes on their books, if the artificial insemination protections were waived and artificial insemination became impossible, most factory farming becomes impossible again overnight. So I think that the real labor protections, if you want to call them that make industrialized animal agriculture impossible, are greater legal protections for animals, which would make certain actions impossible and others so expensive as to be prohibitive.
Can I ask you, Jan, one quick question on this? So, because I thought it would harm the industry much more to grant higher protections or, better wages and also better labor conditions in general. I suppose it would depend on the exact policy, but what's the margin of, if you like, harming the industry that we could get? Very low because the profit is so significant that it wouldn't affect them much, or?
I mean, that's an empirical question that I can't answer. The industry also has I mean, they're producing a mass scale commodity. So what affects the cost is how much you can sell it for to the consumer and what your input costs are. So for instance, years that corn is extremely expensive as a feed can be the least profitable years, which is again, why they try to produce greater volumes, squeeze labor, avoid environmental protections. And I don't know where that line is. And in fact, that would be a fascinating, if anyone listening is into sort of econometric, sort of commodity price modeling, that would be a fascinating study. But I don't want to hazard a guess what that would look like or where that line would be. Yes.
I just thought I will ask the economist and see what if we get an answer, but yeah, of course. The next question that I wanted to ask relates to the visibility argument that I'm sure many animal people will be familiar with it. So it's this idea that if everybody knew what happens in factory farms, in a way, the problem of factory farms would be solved. Michael Pollan talked about the right to see, that consumers have the right to see, that if, this idea that if the walls of factory farms were made of glass, then the consumers' behavior would change dramatically, basically, and there would be at least a massive reduction on the consumption of animals, and perhaps even we would solve this issue. No? And Jan has written on this. You wrote a wonderful article called Transparency and the Factory Farm, Agritourism and Counteractivism at Fair Oaks Farms, where some parts of those farms are actually, the walls are literally made of glass. So I wanted to ask both of you about this, because one of the things that I have encountered in conferences and talking with some animal activists is a sort of sense of shock in which they think, how can it be that my colleagues, my friends, family members, they know about these things? I've told them, I've showed them videos, things continue the same. But those same people at the same time have also said to me, more videos, more undercover, the idea that seeing is believing, they continue to think that simultaneously. So that's something that I've always been quite surprised by, because I think, well, it doesn't seem to match this to think there's a clear contradiction there. So I don't know if I know you do have quite a few thoughts on this. So if you can speak to this a little bit and tell us what both of you think, but then first, because I know you've written about this, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to be brief. I think, in short, I think that it's impossible to make a universal claim about how people react to, to factual claims, right? As we're seeing all around us in the midst of COVID, right? And how people react to, I suppose I would call videos affective claims, maybe. And so I know a lot of people who have, who went vegan after seeing Dominion or Earthlings or something. I know other people who have similarly been swayed to reduce individual meat consumption by watching sort of undercover footage. And so I think some people absolutely do respond to it. And I think others simply don't, for any number of reasons. And I don't want to delve too deeply. And I don't want to pathologize people who don't. But I think that it's just the hope that if everyone saw what goes on factory farms or at industrial slaughterhouses would create a vegan world, I think is misguided in that it misses how different people react to information. That being said, we do have empirical proof that, for instance, when investigations of animal cruelty get large-scale media uptake, short-term demand for meat does fall. There are studies by agricultural economists working at land-grant colleges, so not the opposite of animal rights activists, that actually show this to be the case. And I think this also explains why the meat industry in the United States, increasingly in Canada, has been so interested in the passage of so-called ag gag laws or agricultural gag laws, which are anti-whistleblower laws that prevent the recording of undercover footage and prevent revealing what actually goes on at these production facilities. And the fact that they're doing this, I think, speaks to the fact that transparency, sort of a radical transparency, does not favor the industry. But does that mean that if we had radical transparency, we would have, a mass sort of vegan epiphany? I don't think so. And the paper you mentioned, I want to let Katie speak, and I'm also cognizant of the fact that we have other questions coming up. But so there's actually a pretty radical experiment in flipping this idea on its head, and it's in Indiana. It's called Fair Oaks Farms, and it's basically a model factory farm. So it is a CAFO, but it's a small scale CAFO that's meant to be a best practice CAFO, and it's also a tourist destination, sort of like a rural Indiana tourist destination where they operate They have sort of a dairy farm and a pig breeding operation that actually have floor to ceiling windows. And as a tourist, you can go in and look upon the process. And it's sort of a highly curated vision of best practice in animal farming. But what I think is interesting is that if you look, your reception of what you're seeing in that space depends so much about the information you're given and how you're primed to receive that information, right? So if it's explained to you that, you know, these sows were artificially inseminated, this is what it looks like. Some of their babies will be born as runts at 6 months of age, which is why while they're still children, so not yet fully adult, these pigs will be slaughtered, et cetera, et cetera. That's one framing. But if the framing is, this is best practice, and these pigs are actually happy and they have enrichments, and we have a great team of veterinarians, and these sort of operations are great for the Indiana economy, and this is about food security and feeding the American public, and don't Americans love barbecues, and this is where barbecues come, right? So that's a completely different framing, which will change how you receive what you're seeing. So just seeing itself, sort of raw, unmediated seeing, I think doesn't in itself have a predictable effect. And I think that's what the industry is banking on the one hand with like humane washing and things like fair oaks, and on the other hand with ag gag.
No, that's great. I also wanted to direct people to Every 12 Seconds, where Timothy Pachirat has, I think, a chapter called The Politics of Sight, and he explains some of these things. There is also this case in, I don't know, 16th or 17th century Paris, where cats were burned alive, and it was like a sort of event people were to witness and kind of were eager to see. So it wasn't, just seeing it caused the opposite effect. Not necessarily abhorrence or we should not do this, but it was a sort of celebration, as it were, an event that people really were seeking to attend. But I'm going to move to the next question because we're running a bit out of time. So I wanted also to ask both of you now, but as well, first, Jan, perhaps you can say a little bit about the cell-based meat. And at the end, I want to ask both of you a more strategic question, but perhaps here we can all begin to think about a strategy as well. Because both cell-based meat and plant-based food could play a crucial role in reducing the consumption of animals, but there are also ethical questions here. You wrote an article recently with Elena Burrell, Jan, on this matter. So if you could tell us a little bit about this, and also, Kate, in your case, I know you've done a huge amount of ethnographic work, and Ellen and Jan discussing that article. Sanctuaries perhaps would be the best sites where we could get the tissues to then produce cell-based meat, right? So this is very difficult, ethically speaking, to kind of have a clear answer. At least in my case, I don't have a clear position on this. Although, of course, from a consequentialist point of view, the result is quite clear. Cell-based meat, it would be much better. The animals would suffer much less. But well, what do you think? Jan first, and perhaps then Katie, you can tell us what do you think.
Yeah, so for the people who don't know, alternative proteins, or what we call alternative proteins, the word some people don't like, is the word for analogs for animal source foods. So this is sort of, be it like egg or dairy, or especially meat analogs created that are plant-based, fermentation-based, or cell-based. So these things, plant-based meat alternatives, of course, aren't new, but I think that if we're talking about the need to reduce meat consumption, be it for pressing environmental reasons or out of concern with labor, as we've talked about, although again, that's a gray area, as Katie mentioned, or out of concern for animals themselves, I think basically meat reduction is an environmental and ethical duty that we have. I would go so far as to say that. And I think that these alternative proteins, if they can convince people who are otherwise unwilling to stop eating meat to shift to these analogs, and if they can replace the meat they're eating rather than supplement the meat they're eating, I think that would be a huge win. And so in this context, cell-based meat, which is, of course, animal tissue grown from base cells, fed a sort of a growth medium in a bioreactor, has a massive role to play because it is meat. I mean, biologically speaking, it is meat. It reduces switching costs for meat consumers as much as possible, asks them to switch from slaughtered meat to cell-based meat. And that's not my terms, that's the USDA's terms. So, and in fact, we should probably start saying slaughtered meat now that there are other alternatives. I think slaughtered meat should become the term we use to describe animal-based meat. So in this so cell-based meat, there are a lot of questions, scientific questions about its viability at scale, whether it can be produced safely at scale, whether costs can drop enough to make it competitive. I've been a big proponent of public investment in this sort of promissory technology that has a lot of upside, but a lot of question marks. So I think it's worth exploring whether or not it ultimately works. And I think it will, at least for some products. But the real big question here is the use of animals in the production of cell-based meat, because cell-based meat, as it stands, some products require the use of fetal bovine serum in the growth media to grow them, which is as non-vegan as it sounds, although there's increasingly the development of non-animal growth medium, and I have faith that that will scale. And so we'll get rid of BFS. What we might not be able to get rid of is the need for biopsies for base cells, which would have to come, at least in the case of mammals, from living animals for the foreseeable future. And that's the huge, and that's the really big question mark, I think, between people who have a very strong position in favor of, let's say, animal decommodification and people who have a consequentialist vision of reducing meat consumption, because you would have to get these base cells from animals in some context. And so I'm not going to develop the whole thesis, but Alon Abril, who's an anthropologist who's written a fantastic book called Saving Animals, and we have an article out in Politics and Animals where we basically argue that we ask whether it's possible to sort of bifurcate the animal as commodity and their cells as commodities. And of course, this is not entirely possible, but we think that if animals were raised in a sanctuary-like manner, which is to say maximal freedom from birth to death, no slaughter, no other harm. So they lived as they did on a sanctuary, but now and then, like let's say during standard veterinary visits, they gave a biopsy, which could then be used to grow cell-based meat. This would be, for some people, perhaps completely ethically unacceptable. We think that this would be an optimal, sort of a Pareto optimal solution, rather than sourcing cells from commodity production operations. And that's a gloss on the argument. The full argument, I think, Pablo, you linked. And of course, the big question is, would sanctuaries agree to this? And we think many sanctuaries wouldn't, based on their ethical models, but we think that perhaps there's space for the development of a model that uses sanctuary-like animal treatment until such a time, if possible, that we no longer need base cells for cellular agriculture. That's our argument.
I think, I don't, just sort of thinking about my own work on sanctuaries, although most sanctuaries don't really frame their work in this way, I do think that one of the sort of objectives of sanctuary is to decommodify and sort of de-instrumentalize animals. And so, and that the space and the forms of care and sort of everything that goes on within that kind of bounded space is oriented around that kind of ethic. And certainly there's a lot of variation in sanctuaries, and some sanctuaries do sort of commodify their animals in various ways. But the kind that I'm thinking about are sort of at that, like, decommodify and de-instrumentalize animals. And so that would not leave room for harvesting, cell tissue from animals. But I think one of the interesting things about the cell-based meat is just, what does it do in terms of, our, like, as a society, thinking about animals themselves and how we interact with them, what they're owed. And I think that the sort of continuation of production of this sort of animal flesh through whatever means kind of sustains this framing of animals as consumable, even if these living animals are in, better conditions, not being slaughtered for meat. And I think that, one of the one of the goals of a lot of sanctuaries is really to change and sort of dramatically shift people's ideas and sort of ethics around and treatment of other species. And so I just worry that that sort of sustaining that kind of, this is ultimately sort of from an animal, no matter how remote, might kind of reinforce that kind of instrumental thinking that is so pervasive in a lot of kind of mainstream discourse.
Yeah, so I think that that's actually a very strong argument against cell-based meat. But I mean, my only pushback really is very much like a crude, pragmatic one, which is that meat consumption globally is going up. Some species, I mean, if we sort of shift away from CAFOs and go towards aquatic species, so I mean, the bluefin tuna will eventually be extinct, right? And so on and so forth. And the question is, can we change humans' instrumental approach to animals fast enough to prevent the harms being done now? And so I think if you look at companies, for instance, that are doing cell-based bluefin tuna, if you could get consumers, which is a super high-end product, right, which is not a CAFO chicken, if you can get consumers to switch to that product and therefore sort of, stop the bluefin tuna from going extinct, is that not in and of itself desirable, even if it doesn't quite achieve these optimal ends of de-instrumentalizing animals? And I think my second point is, like the frames we use to understand our world shift. And so I wonder if there isn't a point at which we can sort of disambiguate animals from meat. And I mean, maybe it doesn't happen, but maybe a point comes when meat is something that comes from cells. Meat is the thing that comes from the meat plant and not the animal, right? And at which we can start, and at which perhaps, and I'm being a little bit sort of like maybe sci-fi and optimist here, which is out of character for me, but at which future generations do disambiguate, at which the idea of a slaughtered animal is unthinkable, and yet meat itself is seen as an industrial food product and is perfectly acceptable. And I wonder if that can happen. And I'm not necessarily convinced one way or another.
Well, and that may just follow with the sort of massive disconnection that so many people already have between the animal and the flesh of the animal that they eat.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps this is a good moment to ask you, Katie. You've written a lot about bearing witness, especially, I will share that now as well on the chat, an article in Hypatia called Witnessing Animal Others. And you sort of argue, drawing on people like Judith Butler and James Stanescu, Chloe Taylor, and others, that bearing witness can be politically and ethically really important. But I have sort of heard before some colleagues who perhaps are more consequentialist and think, well, but what would this change for the animals, right? What is this going to do? So I just wanted to ask you, because I think, and it relates in part to what we are discussing, we were discussing just now. So if you could explain why bearing witness matters, and also how can we do it? Because that's another thing that it's quite complex sometimes. An animal dies and one doesn't really know how to respond to it concretely. So, and I even sometimes feel how to respond emotionally as well, and not only with the actions that we do. So if you could tell us a bit about that, please.
Yeah. And, I think the first thing I want to say before I forget is just going back to one of the things Jan said earlier about fair oaks and the way that the sort of discourse around what you're looking at really makes a huge difference in terms of what you're seeing. So I've done a lot of research, and actually some more research this summer on in farmed animal auction yards. And, I know that what I think about the auction is likely very different from what, most of the other attendees or audience members are experiencing, because they're there to buy animals. They're, it's a social setting, and that they, and so, the kind of narrative or discourse that that I'm sort of developing through this act of kind of witnessing this kind of stark commodification of the animal in the auction yard tells one story, and sort of the kind of like jovial agricultural community narrative is very different. So I think that, like, for me, witnessing is a sort of way of kind of politicizing what it is that's being witnessed. And so it sort of helps to, it's an act of sort of attending to the underlying conditions or structures in which the thing that's being witnessed, has unfolded. It's, a sort of ethically and politically like oriented kind of understanding, and then analyzing or processing what's being witnessed. But I think there's, the question of what does witnessing do, I think is a good one, and one that I grapple with a lot, because it does feel very, I don't know what the right word is, but like stagnant in terms of what you can what you can do. So you're not in that moment, you're not doing anything for the animal who is suffering in this auction ring or dying in the pens in the back. The aim is sort of to bear witness to, and then document, and then share what's like being seen. And there's just such a long history of witnessing or bearing witness as an act of really important, social and political change in terms of, human rights violations, for instance. And so we do have a lot of, historical examples of the real value of this, so that when there's, I think that the thing about, or the value of witnessing is really rooted in when there's a condition that, or a sort of social phenomenon that you can't stop in the moment, right? It's this big machine of like animals passing through the auction yard or the slaughterhouse or whatever, that you can't stop that from happening. What are the possibilities that are there in order to sort of work toward change, or work toward, eventually stopping that? And so I think that's sort of where the role of witnessing is. And so, I've, as a sort of research methodology, it's one that I think is really useful. One of the parts of ethnography, or one of the methods that is often used in ethnography is like some version of participant observation, which is, at one end, you're actively participating in what you're observing. At the other end, you're more just observing, but still a participant. And I think of that as sort of like, not always, but it's kind of a neutral, or can be an apolitical kind of method. And witnessing for me is sort of about that, being present, being, a participant in some way. I mean, when I'm sitting in the audience, I'm participating as an audience member. I'm sort of helping to create this, audience of humans, reflected, sort of reflected through the animal and back. And so but witnessing, I think, could be a sort of more politicized or ethically oriented way of thinking about participant observation. And then I think this also gets at just how we access information about violence against animals. And there's, I think Timothy Patchett and Alex Blanchett, have actually taken part in, a lot of the sort of, to various extents, violence against animals as part of the research process. That's how we can access information about what goes on behind these closed doors, and that's incredibly valuable information to have. But, and I think about my own, just what I've said about sort of witnessing violence against animals in these spaces and just sitting there and not doing anything. I think there's like a fundamental anthropocentrism in that, or speciesism, or sort of whatever you want to call it, in the sense that even those of us who are really dedicated to changing, to working in a sort of anti-anthropocentric way, to really, changing sort of fundamental relationships with animals, there's this still sort of acceptance, even in the sort of, oh, this is ethically troubling, but there's this still ultimate acceptance that it's acceptable to watch an animal die, to sit there and do nothing, to participate in killing an animal or artificially inseminating an animal, for instance. And that it really reveals, you know, the depth of like anthropocentrism and how it has a hold on us in terms, you know, so if you think about, you know, witnessing or participating in these forms of violence against humans, for instance, you know, we really can't, I mean, I certainly can't imagine a research protocol that would allow you to, you know, participate in killing or, you know, forcibly impregnating or, you know, just being there to watch this violence unfold. And so, you know, that's something that I think is particularly troubling that I've been thinking about lately, is just then how, what does ethical research look like if we say that we need to like undo or work against this kind of implicit anthropocentrism in you know, among even those of us who are really critically oriented, not only in our thinking about human animal relations, but also in our research, you know, methodologies. So I think there's just a lot of out and there on this, but that it's just a very troubling, you know, topic, I think, and one that I'm, you know, sort of actively working through.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to add per se, but Katie, I want to thank you so much for saying that. And I think that's something we need to think about more, because this thought has like ricocheted through my brain, but I've never articulated it the way you just articulated it. And I think that's absolutely true. That, I mean, especially in scholarship that casts itself as sort of critical, involved scholarship that's question, I don't want to say sort of post or anti-anthropocentric, but that itself questions anthropocentrism, how we can square that with research ethics of certain researchers that place them in situations where they do directly participate in exploited. I mean, you know, and I know that you've borne witness, I'm not sure to what extent I can talk about what I've seen during my research because of NDAs and stuff, but I've also been in situations where I've witnessed violence against animals. But I think there's presumably a line both between, I mean, even being in those spaces and not acting and not being able to act and what that means, but also especially with participating in animal exploitation as part of ostensibly research that's critical of animal use. So thank you very much for saying that. I really appreciate that intervention.
Yes, the same. It spoke to me a lot, and the question of how can we access information and what bearing witness can bring to the fore. Yeah, I have never thought about it in the terms you've put it now, and it made me think the massive gap and difference between this seeing is believing kind of case or bearing witness, seeing by being a participant, by yes, in this more ethical and political sense. I really liked it. I look forward actually to watch the talk again on this moment to see to listen to you again. So yes, because now before we finish, I wanted to ask you one last question and then a little bit about what you are doing now, what kind of research you're doing now. But the last question I want to ask you is about, it's a strategic question really that we have already touched a little bit on it. So if we had as an aim or as a goal to end the mass production and consumption of non-human animals, and this as well relates a lot to climate change, of course, like these cannot be separated or extricated to each other. So what do you think we should target? What should be, I'm also thinking here of animal advocacy organizations and animal activists and kind of the movement. What should we target? Perhaps Jan, you can respond this one first.
I mean, that's a huge question. I think this might seem sort of facile or like I'm dodging the question, but honestly, more of everything. I think the animal question is not really on the menu of policies. I mean, I think if you're in this branch of scholarship or this branch of law, or you care about this and you follow it, you think that there's so much happening, and there is so much happening. And I think we're starting to see much more media coverage of, for instance, the methane emissions of cows, or sort of critiques of the COP summits, sort of absurdly meat-heavy menu and so on. But if you look at the amount of money and the amount of effort going into challenging animal agriculture, protecting animals compared to other causes, it's very slim. And so, at the risk of sounding trite, I think we just need more of everything across the board, including more organizations that can bring the heft of sort of large scale mobilization and large scale investment into the space. I think we need far more advocacy around dietary change, including individual dietary change. I think individual dietary change is absolutely crucial to changing norms and shaping norms and breaking down resistance to policies that might result in dietary change. Right? It's like the more people are thinking about dietary change and are either going vegan or engaged in meat reduction, will be sort of far less swayed by arguments, for instance, of the right saying, hey, the left or the Green New Deal wants to take your burgers away. If you're okay with your burgers being taken away, or you're okay with switching to an Impossible Burger, that sort of critique loses all rhetorical strength. So I think definitely more championing of individual change and individual action. I think more investment in alternative proteins. I also think far more strong legal challenges to animal treatment, be it the Non-Human Project arguing for recognition of legal personhood for animals, be it challenges like the one that we just saw in Colorado that failed to the exemption for artificial insemination to bestiality statutes, be it stronger championing of animal welfare laws. The menu is endless. Like there simply is not enough action. So I think rather than having these engaging in infighting or having debates about, preferable strategy, I think we just need more of everything. We need to make the animal question an issue and put it on the legal agenda, the climate agenda, the institutional change agenda, on the scholarly agenda. I would just say more of everything. I think I've said it a few times now, but I think that's really what we need, rather than adjudicating the minutia of strategy in a very small field. I think we need more people, more money, more institutions, more organizations, and more across the board activism, and far less infighting and far less sniping. We don't know what works best, and we may never be able to, do like a detailed analysis to find out what's more effective or what's less effective. I think just more of everything.
Yeah, I think that covers it.
Fantastic. So then, just the last question before we go to the Q&A. I know that you are both writing books and a lot of other things. So could you tell us what you are working on, if you have any next publications and so on?
John?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Katie,
you
can go
Katie.
first. Yep, go on, Katie.
Katie, please.
Okay, I was just actually looking in the chat, and I think I might wrap this question about research ethics in COVID in with what I'm working on, if that's okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I have thought okay. So the research that I'm doing right now, or that I'm writing up in the form of a book, is sort of oriented as a multi-species autoethnography, and I have a paper coming out in Environment and Planning E, hopefully in the next couple months, on that. And so autoethnography is sort of like an ethnography of the self, and it's a self in relation to others, contextualized in the sort of systems that we live in the social kind of groupings and cultural contexts that we live in. And so I've been thinking about that in the sense of autoethnography as the self in relation to multi-species others. And so it really, I think, so this project I'm working on is that's the sort of framework, and it's also about bearing witness to the sort of everyday happenings around me as the sort of autoethnographer and writer of the book, in terms of sort of everyday human-animal relations. And so I think that that came up for a couple of reasons. The first was that I was really, the research for my dissertation for the cow with ear tag 1389 was incredibly difficult. And really sort of have had some ongoing kind of PTSD like responses to that work. And so I really needed a break, I think, from, going into like active, sort of actively, like active sites of animal suffering. And so looking at sort of what was right around me was, I don't know, something that was like a little bit healing, but also a way of attending to these underlying forms of violence that are sort of made so normalized in our everyday lives that we may not see them as such, the sort of histories beneath these relationships. So for instance, I, did a chapter on animals killed on roads and sort of that history and what it is to encounter an animal killed on roads. Another chapter is on beagles. I live with 3 beagles from biomedical research. And so thinking about, biomedical research and how research on animals sort of underlies all of our, a lot of our, medicine and medical techniques. And so just in terms of, and then in terms of COVID, it was convenient and sort of serendipitous timing that, it makes field research, COVID has made field research very difficult for many people. And I feel bad really for a lot of the PhD students who had planned on doing field work and are now had to just kind of totally reconfigure their entire projects. But I was at home. And so I was at home even more than normal. So it was like a really, good time to really dig into like what is going on around me. So that's this book I'm working on. It's called The Sound of Feathers. And then just to answer quickly and then turn it over to Jan, the sort of research, the ethical review, as I talk about in my book, the fact that when I did that research, I went through the IRB process, the human subjects ethics review, because I was going to be in spaces with humans and doing interviews with humans, and that I checked the box that yes, my research involves animals, which I just sort of did without thinking. But what it meant was that my whole IRB application was routed through the biomedical track, which was just a nightmare because because it meant that they didn't understand the methods that I was proposing. They were like, what's participant observation? This sounds really like shady. And I'm like, this is a really well-established, here's this whole history, these million books written on this as a method, so it caused some problems for the human subjects part and held that up quite a lot. But the other piece was that it, the only way that animals are conceptualized in academic research is as biomedical subjects. And so it brings up a lot of problems with how do we get our research as researchers assessed for its ethical nature, we're basically dictating the ethicality of our own research, which is really unethical, I think. And so there's been a lot of conversations, I think, among people who do field work on how can we form maybe external review, separate from the institution, that would be, a committee of scholars who are, sort of senior scholars who are thinking about these issues and could evaluate a research protocol. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting and potentially really productive things that could come from that. I mean, these institutional ethics review boards have their purpose, but I mean, there's lots written on how inadequate the IRB is even for assessing the ethics of research with humans. And so there really are limitations. A lot of the institutional review is around liability and not around sort of actual ethical questions. It's something that I think is kind of a new area or a current area of real interest and action. Sorry, that went on too long. Jan.
I mean, I'm more interested in what you're doing than what I'm doing, so I'm happy to listen. So in brief, I'm finishing I'm finishing a book about the political economy of meat production in the United States. It's called An Industry Like Any Other, formerly known as Capitalist Pigs, but someone scooped me on the book title. But I promise my book will be better than Capitalist Pigs. But no, I've been doing a lot of public facing work that people may or may not have read, specifically around the climate impact of dietary change and food change. And I feel like I've inadvertently falling into doing quite a bit of myth busting around sort of promissory narratives about, be it emissions reductions from cows, so sort of like the clean cow, green cow narrative, or about making seafood sustainable, or perhaps claims from certain environmental groups that plant-based meat alternatives are actually more impactful than meat, which is false. So that's what I've been doing, and I've got much more stuff in the pipeline. I don't think I can say exactly what it is, but I've got a few things coming out in Wired and Vox and other sort of public-facing venues, just trying to myth bust these fallacious narratives. And I can't really talk about this though, but I'm really excited. I've got my perennial co-author Gabriel Rosenberg and I are working very slowly on a book that presents like a progressive, justice-based worker and consumer rather than farmer and landowner forward vision of a better food system. So we'll see how that goes. You're muted, Pablo.
I am muted, yes. I was not sure if I was muted, and I was looking at the question form that I have elsewhere, so I couldn't see myself muted or not. Fantastic. I look forward to reading both of your works. It sounds amazing. And I mean, Katie, you've already answered several questions, I think a couple of them, which is great because now it makes my life much easier. So, Jan, perhaps I can ask you this first question. Matt Jones asks, what do you think about a maintained or frozen archived cell line?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I am not a synthetic biology expert. I'm sort of a synthetic biology dilettante, which means that I would suggest following someone like Elliot Swartz from GFI on Twitter and reading their reports. But long story short, different animal species can have their cell lines frozen and reused in different ways. So for instance, from what I understand, many fish cell lines are immortal, but many mammalian cell lines with where we are with sort of cell storage and reproduction technology are not there yet. And maybe we can get there. And I think that's the hope. But even now, I mean, just sources of cell lines for current cellular agriculture research and use are a problem within the industry, sort of finding steady, reliable sources of cells. But this is why I champion large scale investment in the field to figure out how we can sort of solve these issues that are at the same time technical and ethical and ultimately political economic.
Fantastic. Yes. There is a question that I was not very sure what. Well, it's on YouTube. So the Dutkiewicz, that's the name, was saying to you, Katie, was saying, not sure how you can witness and not participate in some way. And then I asked, what did he or she mean? And she said, yes, I think as a witness, whether you are actively involved or just observing, you cannot be left untouched and therefore are participating. And then it says further, and I think Pablo suggested the difficulties of witnessing, but being unable to act on it, especially in a researcher role. I'm going to send this to you around here as well in the chat, which I should have done earlier, because it was on YouTube. So I don't know, Katie, whether you have any thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I think being part of, I've been thinking a lot about participation because I want to write something on like witnessing as like, and sort of this participant observation thing, but specifically in terms of thinking about participating, because I think that, I can't remember if I said this earlier, but the like being part of an audience is like a participation in this sort of like human landscape of of people who are watching, are sort of in this like voyeuristic or kind of entertainment based viewing of animals. And so in terms of thinking about, for instance, the animals' viewpoint in the auction, they certainly aren't thinking like, oh, there's the witness, like there's the person who's different, like here for a different purpose, or thinking, differently about this. And so just thinking about the animal's perspective in that way, it's really a kind of an active participation in this sort of how humans are viewed. Patrice Jones writes a lot about, thinking about what animals think about us when they look at us, and I think that's a really important question. I mean, just to think about in general, but also in research, and how is our presence there just reinforcing what is, what their experience is. And it's not a comfort to them to have us here. It's not going to make any difference to them, to these individual animals that I'm there to bear witness. I mean, the hope is that like the knowledge that I sort of share about these spaces eventually makes a difference for some animals, but it certainly isn't making any difference for the animals who are at that auction, or who are at the auction the next weekend or the weekend after that. And so I think, I don't know, I mean, I think it's sort of a fiction to think about just being there, sitting there, and not being a participant, because it is. And I mean, even outside the auction, even though, I'm vegan and don't, eat animals, and, try not to exploit animals as much as possible, like I'm still participating in this broader kind of human culture around, that is very anthropocentric, and even, as I said, in terms of research as well. And so, I think that's a real, cause for ethical pause and reconsideration of what this does, and how animals are experiencing it.
Yes, I don't have anything to add. It's a great response. The only last question before we finish, because it's almost time. Maynard Clark asked us a lot of questions, so I will only ask one. He says, what will we call plant-based meat if we prioritize defining meat as what comes from industrialized cellular bats? So Jan, this question is, I think, directed to you.
Thanks. So I've written a couple articles about this that I think get into my answer in more length. One's called The Modern Meaning of Meat, Wall Street Journal, and one's called What Should We Call Lab Meat? Probably Not Lab Meat, for New Republic. And I'm flagging those if this person wants a more detailed answer. But long story short, there's an etymological question to the word meat in general in the English language. I mean, meat used to just mean foodstuff in the Old English. It only slowly evolved to mean meat as in the flesh of a slaughtered animal. And even then with exceptions, right, such as coconut meat and so on and so forth. So the meaning of the word is fluid. And I think if we look at meat not as being derived from a butchered animal, but as a foodstuff with specific, be it nutritional or gustatory or textural characteristics, then I think the word applies as much to plant-based meats as it does to cellular agriculture, as it does to slaughtered meat. And I think this is especially the case with cellular agriculture, which genetically is meat. So there's no reason to differentiate them when it comes to that term. I think for the sake of consumption, eventually these products will need a prefix to describe their process of production. And I think it makes perfect sense, and it's clear to the consumer if we focus on the prefixes. So plant-based meats would be plant-based meats, slaughtered meat should be slaughtered meat, and then cellular agriculture would be cell-based or cultivated or cultured meat. So there would be many meats, all identified with a prefix that describes the process of production.
Many thanks, Dan. Yes, I think there are more questions, but we will have to close here. So before closing, one thing I wanted to mention is that in our next about our next event, the next animal conversation we are going to have, which was postponed with Chloe Taylor and Kelly Strathers-Montfort on animals, colonialism, and disability. It's going to be released next month in December on our YouTube channel. So we will not have our usual event like today. We will just record it and then upload it there. So if you check our social media pages, you will find it on our website as well, the Global Research Network website. And then we have the next event of our program, the Animals and Biodiversity program, is going to be with Jonathan Balcombe on his new book, Superfly. One of my colleagues, one of the junior fellows of our program, Marine Lexier, she's going to chair the event. You can find information about it on our website and social media pages as well. And then Katie and Jan, I wanted to ask you two things now before we finish. One is how can people reach out to you if they want to ask you a question or know more about your work? And also if there was something that was left unsaid, we've talked about many things, maybe you thought at some point, I would have really liked to say that and you didn't have the chance. Now you have the opportunity to do that too, if you would like to say something else. Katie, you can begin. Sorry, I always forget this.
I have a website. I'll put it in the chat, and there's my email address for contacting me is there, and I try to keep it pretty up to date with the stuff that I have coming out writing wise, and I always love to hear from anybody if you want to write to me and be in touch. Did that come through? Oh yeah. Okay. Yep. And I don't think I have anything else to add.
Yeah, so I also have a website. It's just www.jandutkiewicz.com, or I'm on Twitter probably more than I should be, and I'm just at Jan_Dutkiewicz. And probably the best way to get in touch with me actually is to DM me through Twitter, because I can be truant on email sometimes. And yeah, no, and I can't think of anything else. I mean, thank you for hosting. Thank you to everyone who tuned in on Zoom and YouTube, and thank you to Katie for your insight. I would just say everyone should go read Katie's books because they're really wonderful. Well, the one that's out is wonderful, and I'm sure the next one will be too. So yeah. So thanks for organizing, and thanks for the chat.
Thank you for. Sorry, Katie.
Oh, I was just saying thank you, Jan. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you for everybody who came to join.
Not at all. It was my pleasure. I loved having you with us and listening to you. I always close our events with a quote. So on this occasion, it will be by Kathryn Kim in her book, Dangerous Crossings. And Kathryn Kim says, if disavowal is a closing off, a repudiation, a turning away from, avowal is an opening, a recognition, a turning toward. I thought it was quite suited as well to some of the things we've discussed about bearing witness. And what Jan was saying in part, we need more of everything. Perhaps Clay's adding here a little bit about how we can add more, how we can have more of everything, perhaps. So anyways, thank you again to both of you and to everybody that attended the event and asked questions and engaged with us. And I look forward to seeing you again. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.